201. Sit with that number for a second, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why it might genuinely be the single most important number in this entire war right now. More important, arguably, than any single territorial gain reported from the front lines this month. If you want the full picture of how Ukraine quietly built one of the most effective naval campaigns in modern history without deploying a single warship, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this with someone who still thinks this war is only being fought in the trenches. 201 vessels. Tankers, cargo ships, ferries, oil carriers, struck by Ukrainian drones in just 3 weeks. Not by a navy, not by fighter jets, not by missiles launched from an aircraft carrier, by unmanned systems operating at a scale and with a level of coordination that genuinely has no real precedent in the history of modern naval warfare. And as of this week, the Kerch Strait, the only passage connecting Russia's Sea of Azov to the wider Black Sea, is effectively blocked. I want you to actually sit with that for a moment, because what it means for Vladimir Putin, for his war machine, and for the tens of thousands of Russian troops still holding occupied Crimea is genuinely significant. We're going to walk through exactly how this happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about where this entire war is actually heading. Let's start with where the ground war stands, because you can't fully understand why this naval campaign matters without understanding the pressure it's relieving elsewhere. As of the most recent reporting from Ukraine's general staff, the two sides are exchanging well over 200 combat engagements across the front line in a single day, a genuinely extraordinary tempo for a war well into its 4.5 year. The heaviest fighting continues to center on the Pokrovsk direction in Donetsk Oblast, where Russian forces have reportedly launched dozens of assault attempts in a single day alone, pushing toward a string of small settlements whose names rarely make international headlines, but whose loss, cumulatively, would open a path further west into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. That's the real strategic logic behind Pokrovsk. It was never really about any individual village. It's about what breaching that line would let Russia attempt next. And despite the sheer weight of manpower Russia has thrown at that axis, reportedly well over 100,000 troops in various estimates concentrated around it, Ukrainian forces have continued to hold, inflicting what analysts describe as extraordinarily high attrition rates on the attacking Russian units, destroying personnel shelters, fuel depots, artillery systems, and drone control points along the way. Nearby, along secondary axes further south and east, Ukrainian units have reportedly repelled dozens more Russian assaults in the same stretch of days, a pattern that repeats itself along several other contested stretches of the front simultaneously. This is not a front line quietly collapsing. It's a front line holding under enormous pressure at enormous cost, day after day, and every single one of those repelled assaults represents Russian manpower, vehicles, and ammunition that simply cannot be redirected anywhere else on the map. To understand the scale of what Russia has already lost pursuing this strategy, Ukraine's general staff places cumulative Russian personnel losses since the war's outset in February 2022 at well over 1,300,000. Even applying the kind of skeptical discount factor professional military analysts typically use for wartime casualty claims from either side, you're still looking at losses on a scale that would be considered catastrophic by almost any historical standard. On a single recent day, Russian forces reportedly launched roughly 190 guided aerial bombs at Ukrainian positions, deployed more than 6,000 exploding drones, and carried out tens of thousands of individual shelling strikes. Sustaining that tempo requires an enormous logistics and ammunition supply chain working around the clock, which is exactly why what Ukraine has been doing at sea over the past several weeks matters so much, because it strikes directly at the systems keeping that tempo alive in the first place. Let's talk about Operation Molochka, because this is genuinely one of the most remarkable developments of the entire war, and it hasn't gotten nearly the attention it deserves outside specialist defense circles. On July 6th this year, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, working alongside its security service, launched a coordinated maritime drone campaign under that name. Molochka is a Ukrainian acronym that translates roughly as Moscow will fall because of Crimea, and according to the commander leading the operation, Robert Brovdy, known widely by his call sign Magyar, the name was also chosen as a pointed jab at Russia's own logistics troubles on a key overland highway serving Crimea, since the word itself is regional slang connected to dairy. Whatever the wordplay behind the name, what this unit has actually accomplished over the following 3 weeks is extraordinary by any measure. As of the most recent reporting, Ukrainian drones have struck 201 vessels since the operation began, 129 of them in the Sea of Azov between the 6th and the 28th of July, and 72 more in the Black Sea, after the campaign deliberately expanded into that theater around the middle of the month, timed to coincide with Ukrainian Statehood Day. And crucially, those figures, provided directly by Commander Brovdy, don't even include additional vessels, reportedly targeted separately by Ukraine's security service and other elements of its defense forces operating in the same waters during the same window. The operation didn't stay confined to one section of that coastline either. Reporting from mid-July described Ukraine widening its maritime drone offensive specifically to target what analysts call the feeder fleet, smaller vessels that shuttle cargo from Russian ports out to larger deep draft ships waiting at offshore. Transshipment points beyond the Kerch Strait, precisely so that Russia's larger tankers could avoid the riskiest, most heavily targeted stretches of water. By systematically hunting both ends of that supply chain, the smaller feeder vessels and the larger receiving ships alike, Ukraine effectively challenged the Kremlin's long-standing claim that the Sea of Azov functions as an uncontested internal Russian sea, and in the process began physically bottling up access to the Volga-Don shipping canal, one of Russia's most important internal waterway links connecting the Azov and Caspian basins to the rest of its river and canal network. Here's what makes the strategic logic behind this campaign so genuinely sophisticated, and it's worth slowing down on this point specifically. The goal isn't primarily to sink these ships outright. It's to disable them, to turn them, in Brovdy's own description, into drifting barges, blind and deaf, unable to navigate under their own power, and unable to communicate. Sinking a tanker creates an environmental disaster, a major oil spill, international condemnation, and genuine humanitarian concern for civilian crews who often have nothing to do with the decisions of the government whose flag their ship happens to sail under. But disabling a vessel achieves nearly the same strategic effect, removing it from active service, forcing it into repair or replacement, without carrying anywhere near the same political and environmental cost. That's not accidental. That's a deliberate operational choice, and it reflects a level of strategic thinking that goes well beyond simply causing as much destruction as possible. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, now's a great time to hit subscribe, because we're just getting into the part of this story that connects directly to Russia's ability to actually keep funding this entire war. The Sea of Azov itself is worth understanding a little better, because its size and shape are exactly why this campaign has been so effective. It's a relatively shallow, enclosed body of water sitting at the heart of Russia's logistics network supporting occupied Crimea and the broader southern front. Fuel, military cargo, and a significant share of Russia's grain exports, reportedly as much as a quarter of the country's total wheat exports, all move through it before reaching the Kerch Strait, and from there, the open waters of the Black Sea. That concentration is precisely what makes it vulnerable. You don't need to control an entire ocean to strangle a supply route. You need to control the narrow points that everything is forced to pass through, and that's essentially what's happened. According to Commander Brovdy, the operation has reduced the capacity of the Kerch Strait ferry service, the primary route moving personnel, vehicles, and military equipment between mainland Russia and occupied Crimea by around 75%. Before the campaign began, those ferries were reportedly capable of transporting somewhere between 180 and 250 vehicles a day, with roughly 80% of that capacity supporting Russian military logistics rather than civilian traffic. 3 of the 5 ferries serving or held in reserve for that route have reportedly been destroyed outright. The remaining 2 have lost the ability to move under their own power entirely, and are now being towed by tugboats, essentially functioning as barges, rather than functioning ferries. By early July, Russia had reportedly suspended shipping through the connecting Don-Azov Canal, as well as through the Kerch Strait itself, in direct response to the sustained pressure of these strikes, forcing Russia's own agriculture ministry to begin rerouting grain shipments away from the Sea of Azov entirely. A meaningful disruption, given that as much as a quarter of the country's total wheat exports normally move through that exact route before reaching international buyers. Russia's own response to this pressure tells you a fair amount about how seriously Moscow is treating the threat. Reporting from mid-July indicated that Brovdy's forces had pushed Russia into redeploying its specialized Rubicon drone unit, along with its entire 51st Air Defense Division, specifically to try to better protect shipping across the Sea of Azov and Black Sea, pulling roughly 200 personnel away from frontline positions to do it. That's a meaningful reallocation of resources, air defense assets, and specialized drone crews that would otherwise be supporting ground operations elsewhere along the front, redirected instead to try to stem a naval drone campaign that, so far, doesn't appear to have been meaningfully slowed by that response. In turn, Russia has escalated its own persistent missile and drone campaign against Ukraine's port infrastructure at Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Pivdeny, hitting grain loading and processing facilities directly. One major grain exporter reportedly suspended operations at the port of Chornomorsk after a single attack destroyed tens of thousands of tons of stored wheat and sunflower oil, underscoring that this entire maritime exchange has become a genuine two-way economic war being fought through port and shipping infrastructure on both sides of the Black Sea, not a one-sided campaign. Let's talk about the financial dimension of this, because it might actually be the most consequential part of the entire story, even more than the immediate military logistics impact. Russian insurance companies have reportedly begun refusing to provide coverage for vessels operating in the Sea of Azov at all, according to reporting from Russia's own business press. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. A ship owner without insurance coverage isn't just facing inconvenience, they're facing genuine financial exposure that most commercial operators simply won't accept, regardless of what a government might prefer. When your own domestic insurance market starts refusing to underwrite voyages through waters your military claims to fully control, that's not a minor operational hiccup. That's a systemic financial crisis, quietly unfolding beneath the surface of the broader war. It's worth pausing on why insurance specifically matters so much here, because it's easy to treat as a dry technical detail rather than the genuine choke point it actually represents. No responsible commercial shipping company sends a multi-million-dollar vessel and its crew into contested waters without coverage. Full stop, regardless of nationality or political alignment. That's simply how the entire global shipping industry operates, built on decades of accumulated risk management practice. So when domestic Russian insurers start declining to underwrite these voyages, it doesn't just affect a handful of unlucky vessels caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. It threatens to freeze an entire category of commercial activity across that stretch of water, regardless of how many additional drones Russia manages to shoot down or how many additional air defense assets it redeploys to the region. You can defend against a drone. It's considerably harder to defend against an insurance market that's quietly decided the risk simply isn't worth underwriting anymore. This connects directly to something worth understanding about how Russia actually funds this entire conflict in the first place. The war is financed overwhelmingly through energy revenue, oil and gas sold onto global markets, much of it through what's become widely known as Russia's shadow fleet. Aging tankers flagged through third countries, insured through opaque intermediaries, deliberately routed to avoid Western jurisdiction, all specifically designed to help Moscow sell oil above the price cap Western nations imposed following the initial invasion. When Ukraine strikes a refinery deep inside Russian territory, as it has done repeatedly throughout this year, that's one kind of pressure. When it systematically disables the tanker fleet, actually moving that refined product to buyers, that's a different, arguably more sustainable kind of pressure. Because every tanker sitting disabled in a harbor somewhere represents oil that simply doesn't reach a paying customer and revenue that never makes it back to Moscow's war budget. NATO's own leadership has taken notice of exactly this dynamic. Secretary General Mark Rutte said explicitly at a recent NATO Defense Industry Forum that the alliance is actively building what he described as a drone-ready force, investing directly in the kinds of unmanned systems technologies Ukraine has spent years refining under actual combat conditions. That's a meaningful acknowledgement. Ukraine has effectively demonstrated something the world's most sophisticated defense establishments needed to see, proven in real combat rather than in a simulation or a planning document. That controlling a contested sea lane doesn't necessarily require conventional naval superiority in the traditional sense. It requires scale, precision, and the operational creativity to deploy unmanned systems in ways an adversary genuinely didn't anticipate or prepare for. Quick pause here, because if you want more careful, sourced breakdowns like this one instead of the surface-level headline version most channels give you, hit that subscribe button now. It genuinely helps this kind of detailed analysis reach more people. Here's the broader analytical point worth carrying away from all of this. What Ukraine has built and what NATO planners are now studying closely amounts to something like a new template for asymmetric maritime warfare in real time. The combination of deep strike drone campaigns against energy infrastructure, sustained maritime drone operations against shadow fleet shipping, and relentless tactical drone warfare grinding down Russian assaults at the front line represents a genuinely three-dimensional squeeze on Russia's overall ability to sustain this war. Individually, none of those three campaigns would likely be decisive on its own. Executed together, concurrently, at real scale, and with the operational discipline Ukraine has demonstrated throughout, they create a compounding strategic pressure that Russia's wartime economy is visibly struggling to fully absorb. Now let's bring in the diplomatic track, because it's moving in parallel with all of this military activity, and the two are genuinely connected. President Zelensky met with President Trump at the White House this week, the latest in a continuing series of direct meetings between the two leaders. That meeting followed directly from earlier bilateral discussions at a NATO summit in Ankara earlier in the month, where Zelensky reportedly made clear that Russia's remaining ballistic missile arsenal represents, in his own characterization, essentially the last major conventional advantage Moscow still holds over Ukraine. He's continued pushing allies for expanded Patriot air defense deployments and has consistently framed Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian oil infrastructure not as reckless escalation, but as a legitimate, lawful, and long overdue form of economic pressure aimed squarely at the financial mechanisms actually sustaining Russia's invasion. The diplomatic picture underneath all of this remains genuinely complicated. President Trump has at various points expressed public optimism about the prospects for a negotiated settlement, describing the two sides as closer than they've been in some time, with envoys engaging directly with Russian officials and reporting incremental progress on the framework of a broader peace proposal, reportedly built around a 20-point plan that, at certain stages of the talks, both sides were said to have found broad agreement on for the large majority of its provisions. But there's an obvious tension sitting underneath that optimism, and it's worth being direct about it. Even while diplomatic talks have continued, Russian forces have not meaningfully slowed their bombing campaign against Ukrainian civilian areas. Russian strikes this year have hit Kyiv with some of the deadliest ballistic missile barrages of the entire war, struck a civilian vessel near Odessa, and hit a resort area in occupied Zaporizhzhia, among numerous other attacks against sites with no clear military function. Those aren't the actions typically associated with a government seriously preparing to wind a conflict down. Increasingly, both Kyiv and Washington appear to be operating from the same underlying assumption, that Russia will only negotiate seriously once it becomes genuinely convinced it cannot win outright on the battlefield. That's really the strategic logic sitting underneath everything Ukraine has been doing across every domain simultaneously. Every drone strike on a Russian refinery, every tanker disabled in the Sea of Azov, every Russian assault repelled near Pokrovsk, all of it is aimed at building the kind of leverage that could eventually make a durable settlement possible. Not through surrendering territory or accepting a frozen conflict likely to reignite within a few years, but by making continued fighting so costly, so economically damaging, and so strategically unsustainable for Moscow that the Kremlin genuinely runs out of rational alternatives. Does that mean peace is close? Based on everything currently visible, that would be a significant overstatement, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than promising a tidy resolution that isn't actually supported by the evidence. Russia has shown little genuine willingness to accept any settlement that doesn't effectively legitimize its territorial gains from the past several years, and the fighting happening on the ground continues to tell a far more honest story about Moscow's actual intentions than any statement from a Kremlin spokesperson at a press briefing. It's worth spending a moment on NATO's evolving posture here too, because it's arguably being under-discussed relative to how significant it actually is. The alliance's commitment coming out of the Ankara summit included a substantial new counter-drone investment plan, reportedly in the tens of billions of dollars, signaling a genuine shift from simply observing this war from the outside toward actively reshaping alliance doctrine and procurement priorities based directly on what's been learned from it. When NATO leadership talks about becoming what they're now calling a drone-ready alliance, what they're really acknowledging is that they've watched Ukraine fight this war for years and concluded that future conflicts will very plausibly be shaped by exactly the tools on display here: swarms of unmanned systems, autonomous naval strike platforms, and precision deep strikes against logistics and energy infrastructure rather than purely traditional force-on-force engagements. Conventional platforms still matter enormously. Tanks, fighter jets, artillery all retain real roles. But a meaningful share of the decisive edge in this particular conflict has come from comparatively young drone operators working out of improvised command posts scattered across the Ukrainian countryside, guiding maritime drones toward Russian tankers in the middle of the night. This shift in thinking isn't purely theoretical for NATO planners either. Several member states have reportedly accelerated their own domestic unmanned systems programs directly in response to lessons drawn from this specific campaign, studying everything from the control software Ukraine's operators use to coordinate strikes across dispersed vessels, to the logistics chains that let a relatively small, specialized unit sustain this kind of tempo for weeks on end without the kind of large-scale industrial base a conventional navy would typically require. That's arguably the most transferable lesson sitting inside this entire story. Not the specific tactics used against this specific adversary in this specific sea, but the underlying proof that a well-organized, well-resourced unmanned systems program can meaningfully contest control of strategically vital water, without ever needing to build or maintain a traditional battle fleet at all. There's one more layer worth understanding here, because it speaks to a dimension of this conflict that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Russia's Shadow Fleet isn't purely a military logistics tool. It's also the primary mechanism through which Moscow evades Western sanctions and continues selling oil above the price cap several major economies imposed following the initial invasion. These aging vessels, flagged through convenient third countries, insured through intermediaries deliberately structured to avoid Western jurisdiction, represent a genuine financial lifeline for the Russian state. The International Maritime Organization has formally condemned Ukraine's strikes on civilian merchant shipping, and that criticism carries real, legitimate weight, since some of these vessels do carry civilian crews who have no direct connection to Russian government policy and bear none of the responsibility for the decisions being made in Moscow. War rarely offers clean moral choices, and this is no exception. One more thing before we keep going, because if you've stayed with this analysis all the way through, you clearly want the fuller picture rather than the headline version. Go ahead and hit subscribe now. That's genuinely the best way to catch the next update on this the moment something significant changes. But the underlying strategic reality is difficult to argue away. Every tanker Ukraine manages to disable is one less vessel available to monetize the energy revenue that continues funding the missiles and drones falling on Ukrainian cities right now. It's worth noting, too, that the international legal and diplomatic reaction to this campaign remains genuinely unsettled, with maritime law, experts, insurers, and Western governments all still working through exactly how strikes on ostensibly civilian-flagged vessels tied to a sanctioned shadow fleet should be classified and responded to, a debate that's likely to keep evolving as this campaign continues. So where does that leave the overall picture as of this week? On the ground in Donetsk, Russia continues grinding forward at genuinely enormous cost. The Pokrovsk axis remains the single most critical pressure point on the entire front, with Russia having concentrated extraordinary manpower there without yet achieving the kind of operational breakthrough it clearly needs. Ukraine's defensive discipline along that line continues holding, even under sustained, heavy pressure. In the air, Russia continues launching massive combined drone and missile volleys against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, a tempo that's become disturbingly normalized over the course of this year, which is its own kind of quiet horror worth naming plainly. Ukrainian air defense remains under real strain from that volume, but continues, intercepting a meaningful share of what's launched at it. At sea, Ukraine has just executed what genuinely appears to be one of the most successful sustained maritime drone campaigns in the history of modern naval warfare. 201 vessels struck. The Kerch Strait effectively blocked. Crimea's primary supply route severely degraded. Russia's shadow fleet meaningfully disrupted, both operationally and financially. And in the diplomatic lane, talks continue in parallel, even as the underlying military reality on the ground and at sea will likely shape the outcome of those talks far more decisively than anything said across a negotiating table. What's worth understanding above everything else in this story is that Ukraine isn't simply surviving this war at this point. It's actively innovating its way through it, reshaping how modern military campaigns can realistically be fought by a country without conventional naval or air superiority. And, in doing so, forcing Russia into a strategic position that appears to grow harder to sustain with each passing week. The war itself is nowhere close to over. The human suffering underneath every one of these statistics is nowhere close to over either, and it's worth never losing sight of that fact behind the numbers. The danger of further escalation hasn't gone away, but when you look at the actual military trajectory, honestly, following the logic of what's happening across every domain simultaneously, rather than just the loudest headline of any given day, that trajectory does not currently appear to be pointing in Moscow's direction. Before wrapping up, here's what I genuinely want to know from you. Do you think this kind of asymmetric drone warfare, cheap, scalable, and increasingly precise, represents a permanent shift in how future wars actually get fought? Or is this a set of tactics specific to this particular conflict that won't necessarily translate elsewhere? Let me know your honest take in the comments. I read all of them, and if this kind of detailed, sourced breakdown is what you're looking for, go ahead and hit that like button too. It genuinely helps this analysis reach more people than the 30-second clips flying around everywhere else. Let's bring this together with where things actually stand as clearly as the available reporting allows. Operation Molochka began on July 6th of this year, launched by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces under Commander Robert Brovdy. Within 3 weeks, it had struck 201 Russian vessels across the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, reduced Kerch Strait ferry capacity by roughly 75%, destroyed or disabled the majority of the ferries serving that critical route, and pushed Russia into suspending shipping through both the Kerch Strait and the connecting Don Azov Canal. That disruption has rippled outward into Russia's own domestic insurance market, into its grain export logistics, and into the broader financial mechanisms sustaining its shadow fleet oil operations. Meanwhile, on the ground, Russia continues absorbing extraordinary personnel losses in a grinding offensive around Pokrovsk that has yet to produce the operational breakthrough it needs. And in the air, both sides continue trading massive drone and missile exchanges on a nightly basis. Diplomatically, talks between Kiev, Washington, and Moscow continue in fits and starts, without yet producing anything close to a durable resolution. None of that adds up to a clean, satisfying ending. And honestly, wars this large and this complicated rarely offer one on any predictable schedule. What it does add up to is a genuinely important shift worth understanding clearly. A war where a country without a traditional navy has found a way to meaningfully contest control of an entire sea, not through matching its adversary ship for ship, but through scale, precision, and a willingness to rewrite the rules of what naval warfare even looks like in the 21st century. That's the story underneath the number 201, and it's a story worth watching closely, because whatever comes next in this war is very likely going to keep being shaped by exactly this kind of innovation, on every side, for a long time to come. It's worth remembering, as we close this out, that every number cited throughout this breakdown, the vessel counts, the ferry capacity figures, the personnel loss estimates, comes from sources with their own perspective on this conflict. Ukrainian military officials reporting on their own operations, Russian outlets describing their own losses and countermeasures, and independent journalists and analysts trying to verify claims from both sides against satellite imagery, shipping data, and other available evidence. That's simply the nature of reporting on an active war in real time, and it's worth holding these figures with appropriate care rather than treating any single number as beyond question, even when, as with the core claims around Operation Molochka, multiple independent outlets have converged on largely consistent figures over the past several weeks. Let's talk about who else is watching this closely, because the Strait itself sits inside a much bigger economic story that stretches well beyond this one conflict. Global grain markets have felt real ripple effects from the disruption to Russian wheat exports moving through the Sea of Azov, since Russia remains one of the world's largest wheat suppliers, and importing countries across Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia depend heavily on predictable, uninterrupted access to that supply. Energy markets, too, have paid attention to every report of a disabled tanker, since even a modest reduction in Russia's ability to move refined product to buyers feeds into broader questions about global oil supply stability. It's a genuinely striking moment in modern history, watching a country without a traditional navy reshape global commodity conversations through nothing more than coordinated, low-cost, unmanned systems. Stay with this channel because the moment there's a real, confirmed update on any of this, whether that's further escalation at sea, a genuine diplomatic breakthrough, or a shift in the fighting around Pokrovsk, I'll have it broken down for you the same way, carefully, honestly, and grounded in what's actually confirmed rather than what simply sounds dramatic. This war has proven over and over across the past several years that the biggest strategic shifts don't always announce themselves with a single dramatic headline. Sometimes they show up quietly in a number like 201, sitting in a military briefing that most of the world scrolls straight past on the way to something louder. Thanks for watching this one all the way through. I'll see you in the next video.